So after you've removed your dentures from the ultrasonic, give them a good wipe down, a thorough cleaning with a denture brush and some soap and water. Okay, scrub them really hard. This will not hurt the acrylic base or the teeth at all. So give them a good scrub down, make sure any polishing residue has been cleaned off. So now we have the actual finished product that's ready to go in the patient's mouth. Okay, but before we do that, we are going to fabricate clinical remount casts. Just a bit of a summary here. The dentures themselves, they need to have a very glossy look to them. You can't have any scratches or gouges on them, obviously. A very smooth finish, very smooth to the touch. Peripheries are rounded and smooth to the touch. The underside, if you recall, I went over it very, very lightly, and I emphasized lightly with a small bristle brush that was very flexible, so just to take off any possible roughness. Same thing on the inside. And the teeth are still have their anatomy, because I use very little polishing compound to polish them. So if you kind of rotate them around, you can still see the little fine anatomy incorporated by the manufacturer. I didn't over polish the teeth, and that's a very common error at this point. So you've done all this work, just be careful not to over polish things at this point. So before the next step, what you're going to need, or for the next step, what you're going to need some lab putty, and I have this one here. This indicates the hardness of the lab putty. There's 85 or 95, 95 being a little bit harder, but the 85 is sufficient. And this is a polysiloxane lab putty, and it says here, condensation silicone. So it's condensation reaction silicone, which means the lab putty itself is going to be mixed with get this to open. With a catalyst for condensation silicone impression material. It's impression material, but we don't use that as impression material. Mostly used for lab purposes, such as this. And there's also addition reaction silicone, which comes in a base and a catalyst in a two-part mix. But we're going to use this one today. So what we're going to do, we're going to apply the lab putty inside the tissue-bearing surface, or most of it, in here, and to ensure that we block out any of the undercuts. We want to leave the periphery exposed, about 1 millimeter or 2, all the way around. Same thing on the upper. And we also need to create some retention holes so the lab putty is mechanically held together against the stone that we're going to use for the base. Okay? And I have this little mandrel here, which I'm going to use to poke some holes and create some undercuts within those holes a little bit later. So first thing is first, you want to put on some gloves when you're mixing silicone such as this, because eventually it will irritate your hand. So I'm going to get some lab putty here. This is probably good enough for 2. If you have a hard time visualizing how much you need, before you put on the catalyst, you can kind of tentatively place it into position. That's enough for one, and that's enough for the other. So the amount of catalyst that you add to this putty makes a difference. If you add, the more catalyst you add, the harder it becomes and the faster it sets, so you have less working time. So be aware of that, okay? But generally speaking, you flatten it out to about 6 or 7 millimeters, and you do something like that. That's enough as far as the catalyst is concerned. So then you want to fold it just to get it started. And then I always like to press it up against my palm, and it gives you a nice even mix, a nice homogeneous mix. So from this point on, roll it into a ball, stretch it out, cut it in about half, and then I'm going to apply it inside the upper and lower bases to primarily block out the undercuts. That's all I want. You can leave the palette open because you want as much contact with the stone as possible, but definitely block out the undercuts. And I'll do the same thing on the lower. Roll it into a ball, stretch it out. Maybe not as much in here. Pinch the excess off, not much waste. And then adapt it well to block out the undercuts. Especially back here on at the retromylohyoid area. Now, this I went a little bit past the periphery. I did it on purpose because I want to show you how to correct that. So I'll leave that like that. I could easily pinch it off with my finger, but I'm going to leave it in case you forget sometimes. Show you what to do. I'll pinch it off back here though. So before the putty sets, I'm going to take my burr, the back of my mandrel here, poke a hole, and then open up a bigger hole within that opening. And make sure you do these fairly wide because silicone has a lot of surface tension. And you're going to have a difficult time trying to get stone to flow in there if your holes are too small. I suggest when you first start doing this, do it one at a time because you might run out of time creating these mechanical holes. The more the merrier. If you happen to touch the acrylic base, as I'm feeling now with my little mandrel here, it's quite okay, it's fine. So this area here that I've overlapped, what you can do with that is take a surgical blade. Nothing too sharp. I wouldn't use a fresh blade here because you're going to gouge the base. And then just simply cut off the excess a little more to expose the periphery. Okay, so I've exposed the periphery all the way around. You can further shape the putty. You can bring it in a little bit to ensure that the periphery is exposed all the way around. And let's go back to the other one. Maybe back here, you can see the putty's all the way to the end, but I'm going to cut it just slightly short so I have full contact with stone all the way around. This side is fine. Just wipe that off. So we're going to let this putty set for about 15-20 minutes, and then we're going to mix some stone and make the bases. To ensure that we don't bury the dentures within the stone base that we're going to create. And find ourselves in the predicament as before, trying to remove them without breaking them. What we're going to do, we're going to incorporate a little bit of periphery wax all the way around here now and expose about 1 millimeter or 2 of the periphery. So I have about 1 millimeter or 2 on the inside and a little bit on the outside. So I'm going to get some periphery wax. This putty now has set to a point where I can handle it without distorting it. So I can start shaping my utility wax or periphery wax. And apply it all the way on the outside. So I'll do the top one first. Just take note that the shape of the wax is not exactly round. There's a bit of an edge to it. You can flatten it out just a little bit with your hands, so it's a little easier to adapt. And if you look at it this way, it's a little thinner than if you rotate it that way. So I'm going to use the wide side up against the denture here. And all you want to do is expose a little bit of the periphery. So we're blocking the undercuts on the facial aspect of the base now to ensure that we don't trap this acrylic base inside our clinical cast, so it's easy to remove. But we have our periphery exposed all the way around. So I'm going to cut off the excess here and just readapt that. That looks pretty good. You can certainly take some, use your Bunsen burner, heat up your instrument, and seal it a little bit on the outside if you feel that it's going to move. But I think it should be okay. If you pinch it right up against the acrylic base, this wax is rather tacky, so I think it should be okay. So I got about 2 millimeters or so of exposed periphery on the facial aspect, and I got another 1 or 2 on the lingual aspect past the periphery. So this area of the denture base as well as the palate is going to have contact with stone. There's no undercuts in here. You don't need to apply any separator to the acrylic. It will not bond with the stone. And I'm just going to stretch out my wax just to give me a little more of a wider cast, so I have a little more forgiveness to trim this back after I pour it up and let it set. I'll do the same thing on the lower. The lower one's a little more challenging because you have to go all the way around the facial as well as the lingual. So once again, I'm going to pinch my wax. And I'll start on the top of the richer molar pad here and make my way around. When you're covering, when you're applying your wax over the richer molar pad, cover the richer molar pad completely, because you don't want to trap that part of the acrylic back here within the stone. So I'm going to cover it completely. I'm not going to expose any part of that. So get it into a rough position and you can always go back and reshape it. So I'm going to cover the richer molar pads completely. Maybe just a little bit showing through, not much. Not as much around the peripheries, that's for sure. So this ensures that the acrylic base does not get embedded inside the stone base, and it's a lot easier to remove. We can certainly put another piece of base plate wax in here to block it off completely, but I don't think it's necessary. We can always trim this excess stone if there is any with the burr. So I'm gonna let that set maybe another 5-10 minutes to allow this putty to get to set thoroughly, and then on the next video we'll show you how to do the base.